Inside a frozen mountain, on an island above the Arctic Circle, there is a door. Behind that door is an airlock. Behind the airlock is a tunnel drilled 130 meters into the permafrost. And inside that tunnel, sealed in controlled darkness, is the genetic memory of everything humanity has ever grown. 1.3 million seed varieties. Every crop, every grain, every root that has ever kept a civilization alive. The Norwegian government built it in 2008. They called it a preparedness measure. But preparedness is what you call it when the outcome is still uncertain. This was something more deliberate than that. This was the infrastructure of a species beginning to hedge its bets, quietly, officially, and permanently. Right now, beneath your feet, people are choosing never to return to the surface, not as an experiment, not as a temporary measure, permanently. And the institutions driving that decision are the same ones that shape the world you live in every single day. The question is not whether humanity will go underground. The question is why almost no one is talking about it. In 2016, researchers at the European Space Agency published findings examining how deep subsurface environments might shield biological life from solar radiation and atmospheric collapse. Protection their data suggested no surface structure could reliably match. That same year, the Svalbard Seed Vault required emergency upgrades. Unexpected permafrost melt had sent water flooding toward its entrance tunnel. The vault had been built inside a frozen mountain, and it was already being overtaken by the very conditions it was designed to outlast. But the seed vault is just the part they let you see. Beneath the Atacama Desert in Chile, geothermal drilling operations begun as energy surveys in the early 2010s encountered something unexpected. Naturally occurring thermal pockets, some extending hundreds of meters underground, with internal temperatures researchers noted as potentially relevant to long-term human habitation. The data from those surveys entered infrastructure reports that were not made public. Several geologists involved described being asked to sign non-disclosure agreements before leaving the project. Accounts documented by investigative journalist Sebastian Acher in 2019. Whether those chambers were ever seriously evaluated as habitation sites remains officially unanswered. What is not unanswered is where the money went. After 2015, the world's largest private infrastructure investments began a quiet and consistent migration downward. The Bonhof data center in Stockholm operates inside a former Cold War nuclear bunker 30 meters below the city's granite bedrock. The Peunen White Mountains facility, also in Stockholm, was expanded 3 times between 2008 and 2021. These are not emergency backups. They are primary operations, the living nervous system of global finance and communication, deliberately placed below the surface. And this is where the story shifts from infrastructure into something far more unsettling. Because when you house a human population underground long enough, not for weeks, not for months, but for years, something begins to change. Not in the architecture, not in the engineering, in the people themselves. On July 16, 1962, a 23-year-old French geologist named Michel Siffre descended alone into the Skarasen cave in the Maritime Alps, 130 meters below the surface, with no clock, no calendar, no sunlight, and a strict one-way telephone line. He could call his surface team to log when he woke, when he ate, when he slept. They could not call him. When his team finally told him his 2 months were up, Siffre refused to believe it. He thought it was still August 20th. It was September 14th. 25 days had vanished from inside his own mind, not to illness, not to injury, but simply to the dark. That was 63 days. Scientists are now documenting the effects of multi-year subterranean residence, and what they are finding should disturb every single one of us. When Siffre's surface team wanted to understand how far his mind had drifted, they gave him a test the moment he emerged. "Count to 120, they said, one number per second, a task that takes exactly 2 minutes. It took him 5. The horror is not that he failed. The horror is that he didn't know he was failing. Every number felt correctly spaced. Every second felt like a second. His internal clock had slowed to less than half the speed of the world above, and from the inside it felt like nothing at all. That is what should keep you up at night. Not that the dark made him wrong, that it made him feel right. Darkness does not announce what it takes from you. It removes things quietly, from the inside out. The science of what happens over years, not weeks, is where things become genuinely disturbing. And it begins not with the mind, but with something far deeper, the genome itself. Epigenetics, the study of how environment switches genes on and off without altering the underlying DNA sequence, has been producing findings that make subterranean researchers pay close attention. Dr. Michael Meany at McGill University has spent decades documenting how sustained environmental stress can influence gene expression in ways that echo across generations. Changes observed first in animals and increasingly tracked in long-term human population studies. His work, replicated in laboratories across Germany, Japan, and the United States, suggests that sustained environmental pressure, darkness, confinement, altered atmospheric chemistry, is precisely the kind of stressor known to influence heritable gene expression. Whether that influence, accumulated across generations of underground living, would produce measurable biological divergence remains an open and actively studied question. But the direction the research points is striking. The first generation goes underground by choice. The second generation is born into the dark. And by the third generation, the body may begin negotiating a new contract with its environment. We already have biological precedent for this. The Bajau people of Southeast Asia, documented in a landmark study published in the journal Cell by researcher Melissa Ilardo at the University of Copenhagen, carry a genetic adaptation in their spleens, the organ that stores oxygenated red blood cells during dives, that makes the Bajau spleen 50% larger than those of neighboring non-diving populations. But here is the detail that stops the conversation cold. Non-diving Bajau carry the same adaptation. People who have never dived a single day in their lives. The gene had already been written into the bloodline before the child ever entered the water. The environment had reached forward into the next generation and prepared it for a world it had not yet entered. Now replace ocean depth with geothermal vaults. Replace water pressure with rock compression. The precedent exists. The mechanism is documented. What happens when you apply it underground, across generations, is what no one has yet been able to measure, because no generation has yet been born and died entirely beneath the surface. What that generation might look like is a question science has only just begun to ask. In 2020, Russian authorities raided an isolated religious community in Siberia, the so-called Church of the Last Testament, led by a man known as Vissarion, whose members had lived for years in extreme isolation, some in sealed underground dwellings cut off from natural light. Among the accounts that emerged, community members described experiences they did not call symptoms. They called them adaptations. Heightened sensitivity to sound, altered perception of time, a conviction that the surface world felt not like home, but like intrusion. Whether those accounts reflect genuine perceptual shifts or the distortions of prolonged isolation, no physician has been able to definitively say. But the pattern is consistent with what the epigenetic research would lead us to expect. And somewhere beneath the Atacama, or below Scandinavia's granite shelf, or inside a decommissioned Cold War complex whose current function has never been disclosed, people are already living inside that pattern. Their bodies are already listening to the dark. Because while the scientists watch the genes, the engineers are already building the cages. And some of those cages are starting to look like cities. On August 5th, 2010, at exactly 2 in the afternoon, a section of the San Jose copper mine in Chile's Atacama Desert collapsed without warning, sealing 33 men 700 meters below the surface. The emergency rations in their refuge chamber were designed to last just 48 hours. For the next 17 days, no one on the surface knew if they were alive. Each man received 2 spoonfuls of tuna and a half glass of milk every 48 hours. They drank water from a natural spring and siphoned more from the radiators of their equipment. They lost between 8 and 9 kilograms each. And they did something that would later fascinate psychologists, organizational theorists, and NASA engineers in equal measure. They organized. Without a single instruction from the surface, the 33 men transformed their underground space into something that functioned like a small, breathing city. Shift supervisor Luis Urzua, a topographer by training, mapped every meter of tunnel surrounding them. He divided the space into a work area, a sleeping area, a medical zone, and a sanitary zone. He organized 3 rotating 8-hour shifts to maintain a sense of time and purpose. He rationed food across 17 days of total darkness with such precision that when rescue drills finally punched through to their chamber, their supplies had held. Dr. Rodrigo Figueroa, chief of the Trauma Stress and Disaster Unit at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, commented publicly after the rescue that the miners' spontaneous self-organization demonstrated the human instinct to impose structure on confinement. The mind, forced into the deep, builds a city. But the Chilean miners had one thing that any permanent subterranean civilization would not: the certainty that rescue was coming. Remove that certainty, and everything changes. This is the problem that a discipline called geotechnical urbanism is now beginning to address. Its most serious practitioners are not working in universities. They are working in infrastructure divisions of governments and private entities that have been quietly working toward an answer to the most dangerous engineering question in human history. How do you build a city that the Earth itself will not crush? Part of the answer lies in materials science. Carbon lattice reinforcement, structural frameworks incorporating graphene composite fibers, has demonstrated compressive resistance in laboratory conditions that far exceeds conventional reinforced concrete. MIT's Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering has confirmed graphene's extraordinary structural properties at the materials level. Scaling those properties to full civil construction remains an active area of research. But the direction is clear. The materials that could make deep Earth architecture viable are not theoretical. They exist. They are being refined. The deeper problem is not structural. It is psychological. Dr. Nick Canis, a psychiatrist who spent decades consulting for NASA on isolated crew mental health, documented displacement aggression, frustration from confinement redirected toward other group members emerging within weeks of sealed isolation. In long-duration submarine missions documented by the U.S. Navy, crew members consistently named architectural sameness as the most destabilizing factor. Not physical danger, identical corridors, identical lighting, identical sound, the slow erosion of individual identity through environmental repetition. Subterranean architects have responded with something remarkable. The newest deep infrastructure designs deliberately mimic irregular cave geometry, asymmetrical chambers, varied ceiling heights, surfaces that absorb sound differently in every section. Not for structural reasons, because the human brain, deprived of a horizon, needs to believe it is not trapped. The architecture is not just holding the rock back, it is holding the mind together. And if it fails, even psychologically, what emerges is something no blueprint has ever been designed to contain. Before we move forward, a quick note. Every episode here is built on documented research, verified sources, and visuals crafted to match the facts as closely as possible. If you value that level of detail and independence, consider subscribing. It helps us keep these investigations grounded and uncompromised. Now, let's step into the laws that darkness writes. In August 1971, Philip Zimbardo converted a 35-foot section of the basement of Jordan Hall, Stanford University's psychology building, into a mock prison and locked 24 ordinary college students inside it. Within 6 days, the experiment had to be shut down. Not because of structural failure, not because of medical emergency, because when psychologist Christina Maslach walked into that basement on the 5th evening, she looked at the man running the experiment and told him she no longer recognized who he had become. Zimbardo had been so absorbed in his role as superintendent that he had stopped seeing suffering. He was seeing a well-run prison. It took someone who knew him before the basement to tell him what the basement had done to him. He ended the experiment the next morning. Critics of the Stanford prison experiment have long and fairly noted that Zimbardo wasn't a neutral observer, that he actively shaped guard behavior through his own role, making the results partly directed rather than purely spontaneous. That critique is legitimate, but it doesn't weaken the argument, it sharpens it. If the man who designed the system lost himself inside it in under a week, if the architect became the prisoner, what does that tell us about the power of confinement itself? Isolation creates its own gravity. It bends even the people who believe they are standing outside it. Scale that basement to a geothermal vault, extend that 6-day timeline to 6 generations, and ask what governance structure survives long enough to call itself a society. The most instructive real-world model comes from Pitcairn Island, settled in 1790 by bounty mutineers and their Tahitian companions. Cut off from British legal authority by thousands of miles of open ocean, the community developed its own resource laws, its own conflict rituals, and its own social hierarchy entirely from scratch within 2 generations. By the time British officials made formal contact again in the mid-19th century, they did not find chaos. They found a functioning micro-civilization with its own customs, its own dialect, and an understanding of justice that had drifted substantially from the world that created its founders. Linguists studying the Pitcairn dialect, documented by researcher Ross Clark in the 1990s, confirmed that within 2 centuries of isolation, the community had produced grammatical and phonological structures that existed nowhere else on Earth. Isolation had not merely rewritten their laws, it had rewritten the language through which those laws were understood. Complexity researchers who study how social systems evolve under environmental pressure suggest that closed populations develop divergent institutional logic, internal frameworks for governance and resource distribution that become progressively incompatible with outside systems. 3 generations, 4, 6, the longer the isolation, the deeper the divergence. At some point, the gap becomes unbridgeable. Not through hostility, through incomprehension. They stop recognizing your laws, they stop sharing your values, and eventually they stop speaking in ways you can fully understand. The pattern holds in every documented case of sustained underground habitation. Coober Pedy, South Australia, over 2,000 residents living permanently underground in dugout homes, driven below by surface temperatures exceeding 50 degrees Celsius. Residents described the underground not as shelter, but as a different relationship with existence. Many cannot sleep above ground anymore. The surface has become the strange place. Cappadocia in Turkey hosts cave communities inhabited continuously for centuries, whose entire architectural logic evolved around the geometry of rock rather than the geometry of sky. Isolation does not fracture society, it forges an entirely new one. But every closed system has a breaking point, and in 2008, the world's governments quietly admitted they know exactly where ours is.
They built a vault inside a frozen mountain on an island above the Arctic Circle, sealed it with an airlock, and filled it with the genetic memory of everything we have ever grown. 1.3 million seed varieties, every crop, every grain, every root that has ever kept a civilization alive. They called it the Svalbard Global Seed Vault. And when journalists asked the Norwegian government why they built it, the official answer was preparedness. But preparedness is what you call it when the outcome is still uncertain. This was something else. This was an admission, quiet, formal, filed under infrastructure, that the surface of this planet can no longer be unconditionally trusted to sustain us. That decision was not made in panic. It was made in certainty. And it was not made alone. The Svalbard Vault exists alongside classified deep storage facilities beneath the Swiss Alps, the Iron Mountain facility in Pennsylvania, drilled into a limestone cavern 220 feet below the surface, housing the master recordings, legal documents, and irreplaceable assets of a majority of Fortune 1000 companies. And the Pionen Data Center beneath Stockholm, whose operators have publicly stated that its underground placement is not a cost-saving measure, it is a survival measure. The sum of human civilization is being moved underground, not speculatively, systematically. But here is where the story reaches its most unsettling edge. Because preserving human knowledge underground and preserving human beings underground are two different propositions, and the distance between them may be shorter than anyone expected. Dr. Cameron Smith, an evolutionary anthropologist at Portland State University, has argued in published research that any human population placed in a sufficiently different environment for 10 or more generations could begin accumulating heritable biological distinctions at a rate that, over centuries, might approach the early conditions of speciation. Not guaranteed divergence, not inevitable separation, a trajectory shaped by darkness, pressure, and the absence of the solar spectrum that has governed human biology since the first Homo sapiens stood upright on an African plain, that would be difficult to reverse once it had begun. The surface human and the deep human may not diverge because of ideology or conflict. They may diverge simply because biology follows environment. It always has. We know this not as theory. We know it because we watched it happen to one man in real time in a cave in Texas. In mid-February 1972, Michel Siffre climbed into Midnight Cave near Del Rio, Texas, for a NASA-sponsored 6-month isolation experiment. He brought frozen food, 780 gallons of water, recording equipment, books, and the quiet confidence of a man who had survived 63 days underground a decade earlier. He believed he understood what the dark could do to a person. He was wrong. His record player broke. His books were consumed by mildew. His depression deepened by the week. He began to dread the telephone, his only link to the surface, because the sound of it reminded him of a freedom he could not reach. And then, deep into his stay, starved for any living presence, he noticed a mouse raiding his food stores. He decided not to kill it, to keep it, to have something alive in the cave with him. He set a trap with a casserole dish and a piece of jam. The mouse, which he named Muss in his diary, finally came close enough. Siffre slammed the dish down. He heard small squeaks of distress.
When he lifted the edge to look, Mus lay on his side. The dish had caught him on the head. "I stare at him with swelling grief," Siffre wrote. "The whispers die away. He is still. Desolation overwhelms me." He considered in the silence that followed whether he wanted to continue living. He emerged from Midnight Cave on September 5, 1972. His eyesight had deteriorated. His memory had gaps. He owed significant debt from the experiment's costs. His marriage to his wife Natalie did not survive the aftermath. It took weeks before his eyes could tolerate daylight. And yet, in a later interview for Cabinet magazine, when asked what the cave had given him, Siffre said something that cut through everything. He said he had discovered in the absolute absence of time that human consciousness has a rhythm that belongs entirely to itself, that stripped of every clock and every obligation, the mind does not collapse, it expands. It finds something in the silence that it cannot find anywhere else. He did not call it peace, he called it the truth. Perhaps that is the most unsettling possibility of all. Not that the dark will change us against our will, but that, given the choice, given the pressure, the silence, the crushing weight of miles of rock above, some part of the human species will choose it, willingly, permanently, gratefully. And the ones who remain on the surface, watching the last of them descend, will not know whether to mourn them or envy them.